What if the loneliness you have been running from this entire time is actually the exact condition your greatness requires? There is something deeply uncomfortable that nobody in your life is going to tell you. Not your closest friend. Not the mentor you admire. Not the motivational content that floods your feed every morning promising you that community, collaboration, and collective energy are the ingredients of every great life ever built. Nobody is going to tell you this, so I will. The greatest version of you will almost certainly be built in solitude. In the spaces between the noise. In the hours nobody sees and nobody applauds. In the silence that most people fill with distraction because they have not yet developed the tolerance, or the understanding, to sit inside it and let it do what it is designed to do. Greatness, in its truest and most durable form, is not a group project. It never has been. And the sooner you make peace with that fact, the sooner you stop apologizing for the part of you that needs to withdraw, to think independently, to move in a direction nobody around you has mapped yet, the sooner your actual life begins. This is the Stoic path. And today we are going to talk about the 3 things that every person who has ever built something genuinely extraordinary has had to learn, often the hard way, often at great social cost, always with permanent reward. How to stand alone. How to think alone. How to conquer alone. Not as a philosophy for the bitter or the antisocial. Not as a justification for isolation or arrogance. But as the honest, ancient, stoically grounded truth about what greatness actually requires of the people it visits. Stand alone. Let us begin with the hardest one. Because standing alone is not just a physical condition, it is a psychological one. And it is one that most human beings will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid. We are wired for belonging. This is not a weakness, it is biology. For most of human history, separation from the group meant death. The person who wandered away from the tribe, who failed to conform to its norms, who made choices the community did not sanction, that person did not survive long. And so our nervous systems developed a deep, almost primal terror of standing apart. Of being the one who does not fit. Of choosing a direction that the people around us do not understand or approve of. That terror is ancient. It is real. And in the context of physical survival, it was once entirely rational. But you are not trying to survive a prehistoric landscape. You are trying to build a life. And the rules are different. Because in the landscape of human potential, in the territory where genuine greatness is built, conformity is not safety. Conformity is the most dangerous thing you can practice. It is the quiet, socially acceptable, thoroughly unremarkable decision to become a slightly more polished version of everyone around you, rather than the specific, original, unrepeatable version of yourself that the world has never seen before and will never see again. Marcus Aurelius understood this. A man who sat at the center of the most powerful empire in the ancient world, surrounded by advisors, senators, generals, and the constant pressure of 1,000 competing opinions, wrote these words in his private journal, for no audience but himself. It never ceases to amaze me, we all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own. Read that again. Let it land completely. We love ourselves more than anyone else, and yet we consistently sacrifice our own judgment, our own direction, our own deeply felt sense of purpose, for the approval of people whose lives we would not choose to live. This is the fundamental contradiction that standing alone asks you to resolve. A young architect named Emmanuel had a vision for his career that made complete sense to him and no sense at all to everyone around him. His professors said the approach was unmarketable. His family said it was impractical. His peers said he was making a mistake that would cost him years he couldn't afford to lose. Emmanuel listened to all of them. He took in every opinion carefully and seriously. He sat with the discomfort of being the person in the room whose direction nobody validated. And then he went ahead with his vision anyway. Not because he was arrogant. Not because he was certain he was right. But because he had examined his own reasoning honestly and found it sound, and he understood, at some level that went deeper than words, that the approval of people who could not see what he saw was not a prerequisite for building what he needed to build. 7 years later, Emmanuel's work was being studied in the universities where his professors had doubted him. He had not succeeded despite standing alone. He had succeeded because of it. Because the solitude of his position, the absence of external validation, the necessity of trusting his own judgment entirely, had forced a depth of conviction and a precision of thinking that consensus never produces. This is what standing alone does for the people who can bear it. It does not just test your resolve. It builds it. Every day that you maintain your direction without external confirmation, every day that you move forward on the strength of your own judgment alone, you are developing a relationship with yourself that no amount of external validation can replicate. A relationship of trust. Of earned confidence. Of the deep, quiet, unshakable knowing that comes only from having bet on yourself when no one else would, and having discovered, in that solitary bet, exactly what you are made of. Standing alone is not a punishment. It is a forge. And the people who have passed through it understand something about themselves that the people who never had to stand alone will spend their entire lives searching for. Epictetus, who had every reason to understand isolation, having been born into slavery and stripped of every external freedom available to a human being, did not build his philosophy around the comfort of belonging. He built it around the radical, liberating, terrifying idea that the only approval that has any real power over your life is your own. First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. Not, first ask the room what they think you should be. Not, first gauge the temperature of other people's expectations and calibrate yourself accordingly. First, you. First, your own clear, honest, unmediated sense of who you are and what you are here to build. And then do what you have to do. Even if you have to do it alone. Especially if you have to do it alone. Think alone. The second principle is in many ways the foundation of the first, because you cannot truly stand alone until you have learned to think alone. And thinking alone is rarer than it sounds. Most of what passes for thinking in the modern world is actually something else entirely. It is the consumption and rearrangement of other people's conclusions. It is the absorption of pre-packaged opinions delivered through screens and conversations and the ambient noise of a culture that produces more content every single day than a human being could consume in 1,000 lifetimes. We mistake this consumption for thought. We mistake the ability to repeat an argument for the ability to construct one. We mistake familiarity with ideas for the genuine, effortful, solitary process of actually thinking something through, from the raw material of reality, through the honest machinery of our own minds, to a conclusion that is genuinely ours. Real thinking is hard. It is slow. It is uncomfortable in a way that scrolling never is, because it demands something from you rather than simply delivering something to you. It requires you to sit with uncertainty long enough to move through it rather than around it. It requires you to question your own assumptions, not performatively, not as an intellectual exercise, but genuinely, with the willingness to discover that you were wrong about something important. Most people never do this. Not because they are incapable of it, but because they have never been required to, because there is always, in our connected and content-saturated world, another opinion available to borrow, another framework to adopt, another person's conclusion to rest inside without doing the work of arriving at your own. And this comfortable, frictionless, perpetual borrowing of other people's thought, is one of the most reliable ways to ensure that you never develop the one thing that separates genuinely formidable minds from merely informed ones. Original judgment. There was a woman named Adiz who was considered by everyone in her professional world to be exceptionally intelligent. She was well-read, articulate, quick. In any conversation, she could draw on a vast reservoir of knowledge and deploy it with impressive precision. But Adiz had a habit she didn't recognize as a problem for a long time. She never formed an opinion before she knew what the smartest people in the room thought. She would listen, carefully, genuinely, to the most respected voices in any discussion. And then she would construct her position in relationship to theirs. Agreeing here, nuancing there, positioning herself intelligently within the existing landscape of thought. It was sophisticated. It was impressive. It was entirely derivative. One afternoon, a mentor she trusted deeply asked her a question she wasn't prepared for. "What do you actually think, Adise?" Before you knew what anyone else thought, what did your own mind produce? Adise opened her mouth. And closed it again. Because she genuinely didn't know. She had been so practiced at thinking in relation to others that she had lost, or perhaps never fully developed, the ability to think in isolation. To let her own mind work the problem from scratch, without the scaffolding of other people's conclusions to lean against. That conversation changed her. She began a practice that felt almost primitive in its simplicity. Before reading anyone else's analysis of a situation, before consulting the experts, before polling her network, before opening a single think piece, she would sit with the question herself. Just her and the question. No inputs. No authorities. No borrowed frameworks. Just thinking. Raw, slow, uncomfortable, original thinking. And what she discovered, gradually, then suddenly, was that her mind, left alone with a problem long enough, produced things that no amount of reading had ever produced. Connections nobody else had made. Angles nobody else had taken. Solutions that were specific to her way of seeing, because they had come from her way of seeing, and from nothing else. This is what thinking alone builds. Not just better conclusions. A better thinker. A mind that has developed genuine confidence in its own process, because it has watched that process work, in solitude, on real problems, without any external assistance. The Stoics were ferocious about this. They believed that the examined life, the life of genuine, rigorous, independent inquiry into one's own thoughts, assumptions, and judgments, was not just philosophically preferable. It was the only life worth living. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius with an urgency that feels almost personal across 2 millennia. Vindica te tibi. Reclaim yourself for yourself. Not for the crowd. Not for the consensus. Not for the comfortable safety of borrowed thought and borrowed opinion and borrowed direction. For yourself. Your mind is not a vessel to be filled with other people's conclusions. It is an instrument to be developed, sharpened, trusted, and used, in the solitude that original thought requires, to produce something that could not have come from anywhere else. Because it came from you. Think alone. Even when it is slower. Even when it is less certain. Even when the borrowed conclusions are sitting right there, polished and ready and so much easier to reach for. Think alone. And discover what your mind is actually capable of when you stop outsourcing its most important. We have covered 2 of the 3 principles today, and I want you to feel the weight of both of them before we go any further. Standing alone is not isolation. It is the forge in which genuine conviction is built. It is the necessary, uncomfortable, ultimately liberating experience of discovering that your direction does not require other people's permission to be valid. Thinking alone is not arrogance. It is the discipline of returning, again and again, against the powerful pull of convenience and borrowed certainty, to your own mind. To the raw, slow, original process of actually thinking something through until you arrive at a conclusion that belongs entirely to you. These 2 practices are already more than most people will attempt in a lifetime. But they are not complete without the third. Because standing alone and thinking alone ultimately mean nothing if they do not produce action. Decisive, sustained, solitary action. The kind that does not wait for consensus or confirmation or the perfect moment that never comes. There is a particular kind of person that history remembers. Not the person who waited for the crowd to move first. Not the person who acted only when the conditions were perfect and the risks were minimal and the approval was guaranteed. Not the person who had the vision and the conviction and the independent thought, but stood at the edge of action for so long that the moment passed and the vision quietly died inside them, unbuilt and unmourned by anyone but themselves. History remembers the person who moved. Who took everything they had built in solitude, every hard-won conviction, every independent conclusion, every uncomfortable hour of standing apart from the noise, and turned it into something real. Something that existed in the world. Something that could be pointed to and said, that came from one person's refusal to wait. That is what conquering alone means. And that is what we are building toward today. Conquer alone. Let us be precise about what conquering alone is, and what it is not. Because the word conquer carries baggage that I want to address directly before we go any further. Conquering alone is not the fantasy of the lone genius who needs no one and acknowledges no one and attributes everything to the pure, isolated brilliance of their singular mind. That fantasy is both historically inaccurate and philosophically bankrupt. Every great builder who ever lived absorbed knowledge from others, was shaped by teachers and thinkers who came before them, and at some point in their journey received help they could not have done without. That is not the contradiction it might seem. Because there is a fundamental difference between drawing on the wisdom of others and depending on the validation of others to act. Between learning from the world and waiting for the world's permission before you move. Between the humility of a student and the paralysis of someone who cannot take a single step without first ensuring that everyone around them agrees it is the right step to take. Conquering alone is about the latter. It is about the action itself. The decision to move, to build, to create, to pursue, to execute, on the strength of your own judgment, your own timing, your own assessment of what is necessary and what is possible. Without waiting for the consensus that may never come. Without requiring the validation that may never arrive. Without postponing the work until the circumstances are cooperative and the people around you are supportive and the conditions have arranged themselves into the perfect configuration that, in most cases, they never will. The conquest begins when you stop waiting. And it begins alone. There was a man named Kofi who had spent 4 years developing a business model that he believed in completely. He had done the thinking, alone, rigorously, honestly. He had stress-tested his own assumptions. He had identified the weaknesses in his plan and addressed them. He had arrived, through genuine independent thought, at a level of conviction about his direction that was not borrowed from anyone else's enthusiasm. He was ready. Except that he kept not starting. Because every time he stood at the edge of action, he found a reason to consult one more person. To get one more opinion. To wait for one more signal from the environment that this was the right moment. His brother thought the timing was off. His former colleague thought the market was too competitive. A mentor he respected said the plan was solid but maybe he should wait another 6 months. 6 months became a year. A year became 2. And Kofi, who had everything he needed to begin, remained at the edge. Thinking. Consulting. Refining. Waiting for a permission that no one around him had the authority to grant. Because here is the truth about external permission that nobody tells you clearly enough. It almost never comes. Not because the people around you are malicious. Not because they want you to fail. But because the human instinct, when someone we care about is about to take a risk that we ourselves would not take, is to protect them from that risk. To slow them down. To introduce doubt. To share our own fears dressed as their counsel. The people who love you most are often the most effective at keeping you still. And the only answer to that, the only answer that has ever worked, in any century, for any person who built something that mattered, is to move anyway. To take everything you have built in the solitude of your own thinking and your own conviction, and to put it into the world, imperfectly, prematurely by everyone else's standards, on your own timeline, and let the building itself become the argument for why it was the right time to begin. Kofi eventually started. Not because the conditions changed. Not because the doubts disappeared. Not because everyone around him finally came around to his vision. He started because one morning he understood something he had been circling for 2 years without quite landing on. Waiting for permission was itself a decision. And it was the worst one he could make. That morning, he began. 18 months later, the business that his brother thought was poorly timed and his colleague thought was too competitive had found its footing in exactly the market everyone said was closed. Not because Kofi was lucky. Because he had finally understood that the conquest was never going to begin with anyone else's blessing. It was always going to begin with his own. This is the point at which the Stoic philosophy becomes not just inspiring but genuinely, practically essential. Because the Stoics were not armchair philosophers who developed beautiful ideas in comfortable circumstances and never had to test them against the friction of reality. They were people who built things. Who led armies and governed empires and ran businesses and raised families and navigated the full catastrophic complexity of human life, while simultaneously developing and practicing a philosophical framework designed to keep the inner world stable when the outer world was anything but. And at the center of that framework was a principle that applies to the act of conquering alone with devastating precision. The principle of focused action on what is within your control. Marcus Aurelius returned to this principle constantly. Not because he found it easy, his journals reveal a man who struggled, who doubted, who felt the full weight of uncertainty that every person in a position of consequential action feels. But because he understood that the only alternative to acting on what is within your control is to surrender your life to what is not. And surrendering your life to what is not within your control, to other people's opinions, to perfect conditions, to guaranteed outcomes, is the most reliable way to ensure that the conquest never happens. What is within your control is the work itself. The decision to begin. The quality of effort you bring to each day of building. The integrity with which you pursue the thing you have identified as worth pursuing. What is not within your control is how it is received, when it succeeds, whether the people around you understand it before it proves itself, and whether the circumstances cooperate with your timeline. The Stoic path to greatness is built on the radical acceptance of this distinction, and the equally radical decision to pour everything you have into the first category while releasing your grip, completely and genuinely, on the second. Act on what you can control. Release what you cannot. And keep building. There is an expression that I have carried with me for a long time, and it belongs in this conversation. The graveyard is the richest place on earth. Not because of what is buried there in terms of material wealth, but because of what is buried there in terms of unrealized human potential. The books that were never written because the author waited for the perfect moment. The businesses that were never built because the founder kept consulting one more person. The art that was never created because the artist was never quite sure it was good enough. The lives that were never fully lived because the person living them spent the best years of it waiting, for permission, for certainty, for conditions that never arrived. The richest graveyard on earth. Do not contribute to it. Whatever you are building, whatever vision you have been carrying in the solitude of your own mind, whatever direction your independent thinking has pointed you toward, the world does not need it buried with you. It needs it built. Imperfectly. Prematurely by someone else's standards. On your own timeline. With your own two hands. Without waiting. Built. The integration, what it looks like when all three come together. I want to bring all three principles together now. Because standing alone, thinking alone, and conquering alone are not three separate practices. They are three movements in a single symphony, and it is only when all three are operating together, reinforcing and sustaining each other, that the full picture of what the Stoic path to greatness actually looks like becomes visible. The person who has learned to stand alone has developed something that cannot be purchased, borrowed, or bestowed by anyone else. They have developed a relationship with their own judgment that has been tested in the fire of disapproval and uncertainty and the discomfort of moving without the crowd, and has held. They know, in a way that only experience can teach, that their direction does not require external validation to be real. That their path does not become legitimate only when other people can see where it leads. That the absence of applause is not the same as the absence of rightness. This person is not arrogant. They are grounded. And the person who has learned to think alone, who has developed the discipline of returning to their own mind before reaching for borrowed conclusions, who has sat with difficult questions long enough to produce genuine answers, who has learned to trust the slow, uncomfortable, original process of thinking something through from the beginning. This person brings to every challenge and every decision something that no amount of external information can replicate. They bring genuine judgment. The kind that comes from a mind that has learned to trust itself because it has earned that trust through practice. And the person who has learned to conquer alone, who has made the decision to move on the strength of their own conviction, who has stopped outsourcing the timing of their action to other people's comfort levels, who has understood that the conquest begins with their own permission and no one else's, this person is building something that the first two principles alone could never produce. They are building evidence. Evidence that the standing was worth it. Evidence that the thinking was sound. Evidence, visible and real and undeniable, that the solitary path, the one that nobody applauded and many questioned, was leading somewhere all along. And this evidence, this accumulation of built things, completed work, realized visions, does something to a person that no affirmation, no external validation, no amount of other people's encouragement could ever do. It confirms them. Not to the world. To themselves. And a person who has been confirmed to themselves, who has stood and thought and conquered alone and seen what that solitary process produces, is a person who can never again be fully destabilized by doubt. Because they have the receipts. They have the proof. They have looked at what they built and understood, at the most fundamental level, that they are capable of more than anyone who was watching at the beginning believed. Including, sometimes, themselves. The cost and the reward. I want to be honest with you about something before we close. This path costs something real. The person who stands alone will experience genuine loneliness, not the loneliness of someone who has no one, but the specific, particular loneliness of someone who can see something that the people around them cannot yet see, and who must live inside that gap for however long it takes for the world to catch up. The person who thinks alone will experience genuine uncertainty, not the comfortable uncertainty of someone who defers to authority, but the raw, unprotected uncertainty of someone who has decided to trust their own mind in territory where there are no guarantees. The person who conquers alone will experience genuine fear, not the manageable fear of someone who acts only when conditions are safe, but the full, visceral, stomach-tightening fear of someone who moves before the net appears and trusts, based on nothing but their own conviction, that it will appear in time. These costs are real. I will not diminish them. But I want you to hear what they purchase. They purchase a life that is genuinely yours. Not a slightly customized version of someone else's approved template. Not a careful, consensus-approved, socially validated approximation of what you might have been if you had been willing to go all the way. Yours. Entirely. Built by your own hands, directed by your own judgment, timed by your own internal clock, measured by your own standards of what constitutes a life well and fully lived. The Stoics called the highest human achievement eudaimonia, a word that gets translated as happiness but means something far richer and more specific than the English word captures. It means something closer to human flourishing. To the condition of a person who is living in full alignment with their own deepest nature and highest capacity. That condition is not available on the path of conformity. It is not produced by the life that waits for permission. It is not found in the direction that everyone around you approved because it was close enough to their own that it required nothing from you that made them uncomfortable. It is found here. On this path. The one that stands alone and thinks alone and conquers alone, not because it is easy, but because it is the only path that leads to the version of yourself that was always worth becoming. Marcus Aurelius, at the end of a life lived at the absolute center of the ancient world's most powerful empire, surrounded always by people, by demands, by the noise of consequence and history, wrote words that sound like they were written in complete solitude. Because in the most important sense, they were. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. Stop arguing. Stop consulting. Stop waiting. Be it. Build it. Stand in it. Alone if you have to. Especially if you have to. Subscribe to the Stoic Path. If you have walked with me through both parts of this conversation, if something in these words touched the part of you that already knew this, that has always known this, that has been quietly waiting for someone to say it clearly enough that you could finally stop apologizing for it, then you already know that this is not ordinary content. This is the Stoic Path. And this channel exists for one reason, to have the conversations that go deep enough to actually change something. Not just to inspire you for the length of a video and then dissolve into the noise. But to give you the philosophical grounding, the honest perspective, and the genuine human insight that stays with you. That you come back to. That you share with someone at 2 a.m. because it said the thing they needed to hear. If that is what you are looking for, and you would not have made it to the end of this if it wasn't, then subscribe to the Stoic Path right now. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on your notifications. Because every week we come back here and we go deeper. We go more honest. We go to the places that most content is too comfortable, too cautious, too consensus-driven to visit. Share this with someone who is standing at the edge of their own solitary path right now. Someone who is waiting for a permission that is never going to come from the direction they are looking. Someone who needs to hear, clearly, directly, without softening, that the loneliness they feel is not a sign that they are lost. It is a sign that they are exactly where greatness begins. Send it to them. Today. This is the Stoic Path. Stand alone. Think alone. Conquer alone. And build the life that only you, standing exactly where you are, thinking exactly as you think, moving exactly when you decide to.